Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. It was one of those uncommonly cool mornings in early June, when the sun appeared to hang uncertainly above Baker Street, its warmth muffled by a tenacious mist that clung to the cobbles like a curtain waiting to be drawn. I was breakfasting alone at 221B because Holmes had not returned the night before, having disappeared without a word long before dusk, with only his walking stick and a folded bit of newspaper in his coat pocket. I had grown accustomed to such abrupt departures. In fact, I frequently imagined that Holmes enjoyed the drama of his unannounced absences as much as the deductions they invariably created. Still, I was halfway through my second cup of coffee and the last page of the Times when the door below slammed open and a flurry of steps thundered up the staircase. A moment later, Holmes came in a cloud of coattails, his boots crusted with what appeared to be red clay, a smudge of soot on one cuff, and an unmistakable gleam in his eye that anticipated adventure. "Watson," he said, hurling his gloves at the table but completely missing it. "Have you ever heard of roses growing in granite?" I blinked. "I can't say I have. Nor I." Until this morning. He ripped his coat off and sank into his recliner with a dramatic groan. "Which is why, my dear fellow, we are in the very early stages of what I believe shall become a rather unique problem, one involving a disused cemetery, a missing antiquarian, and yes, a rose that by all natural law should not exist." I set down the paper and leaned forward. "Start from the beginning, Holmes." His gaze narrowed as he steepled his fingers. "Last evening, while you were probably busy with your Hatherley notes, I received an urgent but weirdly written telegram. It was unsigned but mentioned a issue of unfathomable growth in Greyfriars Close. Curious, I went immediately. Greyfriars, as you may know, is the disused burial ground behind St. Luke's in Clerkenwell that has been boarded up for years and overgrown with brambles and decay. Nothing has been planted there since the great cholera scare of 1968. I nodded, vaguely recognizing the iron gate and the tall stones carved with half-forgotten names. "Imagine my surprise," Holmes said, "when I arrived to be greeted by a sight rather than a person. In the center of the graveyard, growing between two moss-covered stones, grew a rose bush, not wild, but purposeful, cultivated, trimmed, healthy, and in bloom." He waited to allow the sight to settle in. "Someone planted it?" I asked. Holmes grinned slightly. "That is exactly the question. The ground is solid granite, Watson. There is no apparent earth under the stones. There are no cracks. Nothing to nurture the roots. And yet the shrub is not only prospering, but it is producing scarlet flowers so vibrant that even a botanist would label them unnatural." He stood and paced to the window. To this picture, add a second problem. Peter Drelincourt, a retired bookseller, with an unusual interest in medieval horticulture, vanished from his Holloway apartment 4 nights ago. No struggle, no theft, and no note. Vanished as if folded into the fog. "That name rings faintly," I said. "Drelincourt. Didn't he give a talk about grave plants?" "Symbolism in sepulchral botany, to be precise," Holmes explained. He was intrigued with the connotations Victorians assigned to graveyard flora. The weeping willow for sadness, the ivy for loyalty, and the rose for love that transcends death. And now he is gone, and in a long-forgotten cemetery, a rose blossoms from stone. "Coincidence? I do not think so." I stood, totally engrossed. "You believe Drelincourt planted it?" "I suppose they did, and I feel that conduct conveys a message or a lure." Just then there was a strong rap at the door, and Mrs. Hudson's voice emerged. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade is here." Holmes hardly had time to look at me when Lestrade emerged in the doorway, cap in hand, his customary air of professional displeasure tempered, I believe, with genuine concern. "Morning, gentlemen." "Holmes, this cannot wait. I have a dead man in Clerkenwell." "Found at dawn?" Not 10 paces from where I'm informed you were rummaging around last night. Holmes's eyes brightened up. A man? Lestrade nodded sadly. Middle-aged, beard, spectacles in his coat. No paperwork. However, there is a message attached to his waistcoat pocket. 3 words, in floral ink. And they are? Holmes inquired, having already retrieved his coat. Lestrade's voice sounded flat. Follow the bloom. We stared at him in silence. Holmes let out a low chuckle and turned toward me. Watson, please bring your revolver and thickest boots. The rose appears to have begun to bleed, and with that, we followed Lestrade down the stairs into the morning fog, which was thickening as if determined to conceal whatever secrets bloomed among the stones of Greyfriars Close. The ride to Clerkenwell was almost silent, except for the repetitive clatter of the hansom cab's wheels and the occasional angry remark from Lestrade, who appeared caught between professional envy and actual discomfort. Holmes, as was his habit during periods of great concentration, kept his arms folded and his eyes half closed, his tall form leaning ever so slightly toward the window, not to look forth but to withdraw inward. I knew better than to disrupt such an atmosphere. I meantime engaged myself with piecing together what little we knew: Drelincourt's disappearance, the aberrant rose bush in stone, the terrible note on the deceased man's body. It had the feel of something ancient and intentional, as if we had walked into the middle of a ritual whose meaning was just out of grasp. Greyfriars Close was just as Holmes described: narrow iron gates twisted on their hinges, stone markers, discoloured by soot and time, and the heavy, cloying aroma of moist earth despite the dry season. It lay sunken, as if the rest of the city had risen over time, leaving this forgotten tract behind. At the centre was the rosebush, a twisting, blood-red bloom against the monotone of stone, glistening as if newly washed by rain. But there had been no rain. It pulsated with colour. Holmes did not approach it immediately. Instead, he turned to the constables who had cordoned off the area and requested to see the body. Lestrade led us without ceremony beyond a low line of decaying headstones to the corpse, which was curled slightly on one side, knees tucked and hands clasped in prayer. The man's face was pallid and calm. He may have been asleep if his skin hadn't been somewhat blue around his lips. He had a well-kept wool coat, and a narrow-brimmed hat had fallen alongside him. One boot was unfastened. Holmes crouched without hesitation to examine the hands, mouth, and nostril margins. He sniffed the fingertips and moved a pocket lens up to the collar. I noticed the glitter in his eyes, the small upward flare of the brows, always the best indicator that anything had astonished him. There are no signs of violence, Lestrade stated. There is no wound, no bruises, no blood. Holmes made a quiet hum. And yet, he is undoubtedly dead. Can I view the note? Lestrade retrieved a little evidence pouch and handed it to him. Inside was a folded square of heavy paper, similar to that used in elegant invitations. 3 words are engraved in elegant copperplate script: "Follow the bloom." Holmes twisted it in his fingers. There's no watermark. There are no fold creases. This was not written hastily or carried for long, a note written for theatrical effect and purposely put here. It stinks of performance, Lestrade. I thought you might say that. Did you move the body at all? No. Constable found him like this at dawn, lying just as he was. Holmes knelt again and carefully studied the soil around the body, softly stroking it with his fingers. He picked up a slice of something and held it in front of me. A flake of beeswax, he muttered. Watson, take notes. This man's shoes are completely dry and unscuffed, despite the fact that the trail he must have traversed is covered in damp moss and jagged pebbles, and peek beneath the hem of his trousers. No sign of dampness or soil. And yet, he pointed, toward the grass just beyond the rosebush. There were obviously 2 sets of tracks, one far larger than the other. Both stopped near the bush and did not return. He was placed here, I explained. Holmes nodded. Carried. And by someone who is careful not to leave a trail that the untrained eye may detect. This tells us 2 things. They were confident and purposeful. Lestrade's face puckered. "So you think this is murder?" "I think," remarked Holmes, rising to his full height, "that this is theatre masquerading as death, or death masquerading as play. Possibly both. Watson, get your case and inspect the body. I have a notion but lack the evidence to back it up." I followed instructions and conducted a brief examination. The pupils were dilated and receptive to light. The heart was quiet, the lungs had stopped moving, and the limbs were starting to chill yet remaining flexible. Most surprisingly, there was no sign of rigor mortis, not in the jaw, hands, or spine. This was not the rigidity of a guy who had died. It was the calm of someone who had just been hushed. "No bruising," I reported. "No injection marks that I can see." He seemed to have simply stopped. Holmes muttered something under his breath before moving toward the rose bush. He crouched and softly caressed a petal before withdrawing a handkerchief and wrapping it around the stem, extracting the entire bloom and holding it close to his nose. He sniffed it once. Then again. Slow. Fascinating. I moved closer. "What do you smell?" Holmes straightened. "Rose, but not just roses. There is a subtle undertone of laudanum. Opium. There's something else I can't quite place. Metallic, medicinal, artificial." He turned to Lestrade. "Get the rose analyzed, each compound, each trace element, and find out who has access to the cemetery. It cannot have been left unguarded all these years. Someone has the keys, whether literally or bureaucratically." Lestrade murmured something about red tape before walking off to talk with the nearest constable. Holmes was already buried in contemplation, walking in tight circles across the grass. Then he paused. His gaze shifted to the church ruins at the far end of the graveyard, where ivy clung to the charred remains of a stone wall. He moved forward without saying anything, motioning for me to follow. As we neared, I saw what had taken his attention. Shovel lay half buried in the wall's shade, old but not corroded, with a silky handle. A little leather satchel lay near it, crushed against the granite. Holmes grabbed it up and carefully opened it. Inside there were gardening tools, a tin of plant salve, and a little black cloth-bound notebook. The cover featured the initials, PD etched in fading gold. Holmes grinned, not from pleasure but from recognition. "I'm Peter Drelincourt, our disappeared scholar." He flipped open the notebook. The pages were full of tight, looping script, formulas, Latin phrases, root system, sketches. At the top of one sheet, underlined twice, were the words sanguis rosa, blood rose. He passed it to me. It seems Mr. Drelincourt was not content with merely studying the language of cemetery plants. He planned to raise one that could recite its own dreadful verse. And now he's missing. "Or worse," Holmes replied quietly. I took another look at the dead man. "You think that's not Drelincourt?" "I think it may be someone who read too far into Drelincourt's ideas and decided to make them manifest." He touched the notebook's spine thoughtfully. "Watson, there is a sentence here. Listen. That which cannot grow must be nourished with silence, stillness, and surrender. Only then will the bloom reveal the truth." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Holmes directed his gaze on the body. "It means our victim may not yet be truly dead." And with that, he turned on his heel and walked toward the waiting cab. "Come, Watson. We must speak with someone who understands the language of ancient poisons. There is a chemist in Lambeth whose shelves may contain the truth about a rose that blossoms from stone." We had hardly settled into the hansom cab when Holmes spoke, his voice low and fast, his thoughts well ahead of our journey. He clutched the black notebook tightly in one hand, the pages flapping in the breeze from the open window, but his gaze was concentrated on the ideas forming behind his eyes. "Watson," he asked, "do you remember the Parsi case in Lambeth last year? The man who went into a trance after handling a supposed cursed manuscript?" I nodded. "He remained unconscious for nearly 2 days, if I recall." "Indeed. However, chemistry, not superstition, did him in. A rare alkaloid compound extracted from a troppa belladonna and refined with mercury salts, nearly undetectable by conventional means and capable of causing a suspended state, neither life nor death." My stomach turned slightly at the prospect. "You believe our man in the cemetery may have been similarly afflicted?" "It is possible. His pupils, his limbs, and the faint warmth still clinging to his skin all indicate to paralysis rather than death. If we had buried him by nightfall, he might have woken up under the stone. But to what purpose? Holmes taps the notebook. Watson, this is not the product of a maniac. If it is meticulous craziness. The rose, the melody, the state of the body, all are intended to elicit a reaction, to be discovered. Someone is giving a demonstration. A demonstration of what? He turned to face me, and for a brief moment I noticed something unusual in Holmes's expression. Not fear, precisely, but the careful respect he held for foes worthy of his thought, of control, over life, death, and even perception itself. After that, we rode silently through Lambeth's winding alleys, past chimneys and warehouses that emitted grey plumes into the sky, until we arrived at a small, modest shop front hidden between a pawnbroker's and a cobbler's. The sign over the entrance simply stated, "Drebber and Cupboards, Botanical Curiosities and Chemical Preparations." Inside, the air was dense with the aroma of dried herbs, vinegar, and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. Bottles of many shapes and sizes lined the shelves, many of them unlabeled, while weird roots curled in jars along the ledge like museum specimens. A thin man with a skull-like face and yellow-tinted spectacles emerged from behind a curtain, wiping, his hands on a cloth that resembled a relic rather than a rag. He looked at us with neither welcome nor distrust, just a kind of detached curiosity. He said, "Mr. Holmes," with a weak, papery voice. "You come again." Holmes nodded. "Mr. Drebber, I'd like your perspective on a hypothetical chemical, Drebber." Lifted his eyebrow. As always, Holmes grabbed a scrap of paper from his pocket and began listing Latin and Greek compounds, some of which I recognized and others not. Drebber grumbled softly at several, and at one he took a step back. "That combination," he replied slowly, "would induce torpor so severe as to resemble death, provided the dosage was accurate. Too much, and the brain shuts down completely. Too little and consciousness is stuck. A waking paralysis. Would the subject appear dead to a medical examiner? To a thoughtless person, certainly. Without the proper exams, it is possible that a competent one will be selected. The skin cools, the heart slows, and the breath fades into quiet. Only the most sensitive barometer of pulse or pupil might reveal the delusion." Holmes handed over the plucked rose. "Do you smell anything familiar?" Drebber grabbed it with gloved hands, breathed, and narrowed his eyes. "There is a touch of opiate. There's also something artificial, synthetic." He shifted to a tall device on the rear bench and began prepping for extraction. As he worked, Holmes turned to me. "There is a pattern developing. Drelincourt's passion was not merely symbolic, it was alchemical. He wanted to create a bloom that defied both nature and expectation, something that thrived where it shouldn't, and in doing so, sent a message. A message for whom? It appears to be for us. Or if someone is monitoring us, you see, I now believe that Drelincourt is not lost, but rather hiding, in plain sight, or in a state of sleep, and that someone else has utilized his work to make a point. About control, I explained again. Holmes nodded. Or about the resurrection, concerning the reanimation of the presumed dead. Consider the repercussions if such a chemical were perfected. The power it would bestow upon its wielder, not just chemically but theatrically. To pretend death, to stimulate it, to reverse it, Drebber interrupted. "Mr. Holmes," we crossed the room. He held up a little bottle of translucent liquid that glowed faintly in the gaslight. "It was plucked from your rose. It contains opium derivatives, belladonna, digitalis, and something I've never seen before. A dilution-resistant binding agent. Whoever prepared this, Mr. Holmes, knew exactly what they were doing. It is not only a poison, it's a sentence, metaphorically, Drebber explained. The body ceases to operate. The mind lingers. A punishment more poetic than fatal." We left shortly after, and Holmes was deep in contemplation as we walked outside. Then he came to an abrupt halt, his gaze riveted on something across the street. There, wandering carelessly through the crowd, was a figure in a grey overcoat and soft cap, carrying a satchel similar to the one we discovered in the graveyard. His gait was irregular and somewhat bent. Holmes's gaze sharpened like a sword. "Watson," he replied quietly. "Do you see that man?" "Yes." "Don't follow him immediately. I will take the long way around. Observe him until I return." Before I could inquire why, Holmes slipped into the mob. I kept my gaze riveted on the figure. He hesitated at a corner, looked back once, and then continued on. He didn't appear to be aware of me, but there was an unsettling stiffness in his shoulders, as if he expected to be pursued. He turned down an alley. I followed from a distance. When I approached the alley's mouth, all I could hear was the echo of retreating footsteps, and then a violent noise. A gentle cry. I hurried onward. The man's satchel lay leaned against a wall, but the man was gone. Holmes was beside me moments later, having circled back from the other side. "He's clever," Holmes remarked, and terrified. But he did leave us something. He opened the satchel with care. Inside was another rose, identical like the first but wrapped in vellum. The note reads, "He is not dead. However, if you contact him, he will be." Holmes folded the note, pocketed it, and stood. "Watson, we must act quickly before this game slips out of our reach. We're being cautioned but also challenged. Drelincourt is alive, however, someone is using him as a message. We must decipher it before the sender becomes impatient." He stepped out of the alley, his coat flaring like raven wings, and whistled for a cab. "Back to Baker Street," he said. "We must consult the records. If I am correct, this is no longer a mystery, but rather a performance. And the next scene starts tonight." When we returned to Baker Street, the sun had begun to set behind the hazy curtain of London's skyline, creating a sickening orange tinge across the roofs. Holmes, who had been silent since our departure from Lambeth, moved with quiet urgency, removing his coat without ceremony and proceeding directly to the bookshelf beneath the window, where he retrieved a thin, leather-bound volume and placed it flat on the desk. "The index," he said quietly to himself. "That weird personal catalogue of cases, criminals, and chemical curiosities, compiled over years and held with the devotion another man might pay a holy text, was Holmes's most valued reservoir of pattern and precedent." He quickly turned through its pages, then paused and pressed a line near the bottom of a folio labelled "ER, here it is." "Watson, read this." I leaned over. The entry mentioned Raskin Theophilus, also known as Arbogast or Vireo, an amateur pharmacologist, expelled from the Royal College for conducting unethical studies using induced coma states, obsession with botanical manipulation and theatrical illusions. Last known address, Sion Hill Asylum, discharged in mysterious circumstances in 1889. Holmes's face was tight with expectation. I had not thought of Raskin in years, he told me. He was clever, a failed genius in the truest sense. He made up for his lack of discipline with show. His thesis on conscious stasis was laughed out of, Edinburgh, but I recall the form of his argument was dangerously brilliant. Like all theatrical geniuses, he sought awe rather than acclaim. "And you think he's behind this?" Holmes stood and paced. "He obviously supports the idea. It is uncertain whether Raskin is referring to himself or a follower. However, the rose, the body, and the note all accurately reflect his approaches, an enigma designed to attract attention rather than conceal it. A performance that grows more elaborate with each scene." He tapped the notebook again, his finger settling on the words "Sanguis Rosa." "This is not a clue, Watson, it is an invocation." I sat across from him, my thoughts rushing to keep up with the scope of his supposition. "But to what end?" "What? And does the perpetrator want us to do? To watch?" Holmes replied quietly. "To see what he's created and possibly to acknowledge it. What bothers me is not that he left a message, but that he gave us the means to find it." A harsh knock on the door interrupted my response. It was unhurried, 3 hard taps, as if from someone who was confident they would be heard. Mrs. Hudson entered with her usual hurried demeanor. "A gentleman to meet you, Mr. Holmes. He refused to provide his name. I only said you'd understand." Holmes inclined his head. "Show him up." A moment later, the visitor came at the doorway. He was little, bird-like in stature, with a thin moustache and spectacles that appeared somewhat too wide for his narrow face. He donned a velvet jacket and carried a hat, his hands trembling slightly. However, there was an unusual fixation in his stare, as if he wasn't fully present. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice high and steady, "I believe I'm being followed, and I suppose it could be me." Holmes motioned to the settee. "Please, sir, begin at the beginning." The man sat down and carefully adjusted his cuffs. "My name is Rafe Collings. I am, or was, a student of Peter Drelincourt. I helped him transcribe numerous of his unpublished treatises, the majority of which focused on the symbolic encoding of plants in burial rites. He frequently mentioned the Sanguis rosa, not as a fiction but as a possible reality, a bloom that only appeared in stillness and shadow. I thought it was a metaphor until a fortnight ago, when he started receiving packages." "What kind of packages?" Holmes asked. "Vials, dried roots, inkless manuscripts that appeared to have been written with invisible ink." He was ecstatic, and then scared. He said someone was testing him. Alternatively, you can test the rose. It was no longer his. Holmes's expression intensified. "And what did you do?" "I've departed." I informed him that it was nonsense. "I regret it now." Holmes folded his hands. "What do you mean when you say you're being followed by yourself?" Collings' lips tightened. "I mean, 3 nights ago, I noticed someone standing outside my building. Not simply watching, mirroring, same hat, same coat, same limp." I shifted to the left and he followed suit. When I crossed the street, he did not follow, but his gaze did. I returned home and locked the door, and this morning someone put something on my windowsill. He reached into his coat and withdrew a single crimson rose, identical to the others. This one, however, had a pin through the stem, with a scrap of black ribbon descending from it. Holmes took it cautiously. Theatrical indeed. Then I noticed a man following me again, this time from the bus. I ran. "I remembered Drelincourt talking about you." "And I came here." Holmes nodded once and then turned to face me. "Watson, get my files for symbolic impersonation, and bring the map of Greater London." As I moved to comply, he looked back at Collings. "This man you saw, this mirror, did he ever speak?" "No." "Did you ever see his face?" "No, it was in shade, but I felt like it was mine." Holmes stood with the rose flattened between blotter paper. "We must visit Drelincourt's home, immediately. Something is unfolding, carefully timed and precisely created. If my suspicions are true, there is a destination rather than merely a message, and we're being driven towards it step by step." "But to what purpose?" I asked again helplessly. "To bring us into the garden," Holmes explained, "and once there, to show us what has been growing in the dark." We took off immediately, Collings, in tow, his pale hands twisting his hat as we cycled through the shadowy London streets toward Holloway. The sky had darkened to a velvet grey, and a chill had crept in the air, raising the hairs at the nape of the neck, not from cold, but from anticipation. Drelincourt's residence was a narrow brick structure sandwiched between 2 larger houses, both shuttered and silent. There was something oddly theatrical about it, as if the house itself had been placed there for effect. Holmes knocked once, twice, and finally tested the door. It began with a quiet groan. Inside, the air was stale and had a subtle medicinal odor. The sitting room was in disarray, with papers strewn about, books pulled from shelves, and a single chair facing the window. But there was no trace of a battle. Holmes went carefully through the rooms, keeping his eyes vigilant. In the bedroom, he paused in front of a writing desk. On it sat a single page, as if waiting for a reader. It was scribbled in Drelincourt's looping script. "You have seen the bloom. Now look at the seed. He waits beneath what has been buried." Holmes breathed slowly. "He is under something. Or someone is." Collings lingered behind us. "He used to speak of a cellar, but I never saw one." Holmes turned. "Then it's time to find it. If he's still alive, he may not be for much longer. And if he is not, what lies beneath could be even more crucial." He pulled a lantern from the wall, lit it with a match, and turned to face the far end of the hallway. "Watson, Collings, pay close attention. I think the next scene is about to begin." The light created long, shivering shadows down the tiny corridor. As Holmes led the way, his motions slow but exact, the flame in his fingers flickering with each measured step. The corridor sloped gently downward, the walls shrinking as if the house itself was dragging us within, toward a throat of silence. Collings stood behind me, clutching his coat collar with white-knuckled fingers. I could hear him catch his breath every time a floorboard groaned beneath us. At the end of the passage, Holmes paused before a low wooden door, nearly covered by an old tapestry with faded rose designs. He took it aside and examined the frame through his lens, wiping dust from a seam just above the grip. There was a faint but distinct remnant of unsettled powder, chalk, perhaps, or fine brick dust, clinging to the edges of the wood, as if the door had been opened recently but not frequently. "Stand back," he instructed softly. With a little push, the door slid inward, revealing a steep stone staircase leading into the darkness. The air that rose to meet us was colder than I imagined, tinted with iron and mildew, and something other, beneath it, something dry, scented, almost flowery. Holmes descended first, holding the lantern low. I followed, the walls surrounding us tighter with each step, until the steps led to a cavernous dungeon of brick and old stone. It was just about 20 feet square, with a low and arched ceiling and shelves lined with glass jars and leather-bound volumes on the far wall. The table in the center of the room caught the most attention, not the books or jars, a tall oak slab, worn smooth at the edges, with the distinct form of a man beneath a sheer linen covering. A single candle burnt at his head, lighting his still features with wavering golden light. Holmes moved quickly and peeled aside the cloth with the delicate touch of a surgeon. It was Drelincourt, though his hair was now streaked with white, and the skin around his temples had drawn tight against the bone. The delicate scholar's features remained unmistakable, the high forehead, the small jaw, and the slender, tapering fingers. He lay motionless, eyes closed and lips parted slightly, as if on the verge of taking a breath. But no one came. A little stand behind him held an open notebook that was nearly full. Holmes snatched it up and gently flipped the pages, his face deepening with each one. "This is not a death," he mumbled. "It's a confession." I approached that table and caressed Drelincourt's wrist. Cool, no pulse, yet the skin preserved its elasticity, no evidence of actual deterioration. I unzipped his shirt slightly, placed my stethoscope on his chest and listened. Nothing. On the second listen, there is a faint whisper of sound. Not a beat, not a breath, just the faintest vibration. A flutter deep within the tissues. I drew back sharply. "He's alive." Holmes nodded without surprise. "Suspended, preserved, as he intended to be." Collings took a tentative step forward, his gaze wide. "But why would he do this to himself?" Holmes did not respond at once. Instead, he gave me the last page of the journal. The writing was tighter and more furious. Before it can calm the body, the formula must first silence the mind. In the silence, the bloom talks. The rose flourishes where it should not, because death is not the end, but rather the soil. "If you find me, know that I agreed. But beware, the others don't share my apprehension." Holmes turned to me, his tone abruptly fierce. "We must revive him. Tonight. We can't wait. He is the only person I know who has gone beyond the theoretical." I paused. "Fantutinde. Holmes, we don't know what he took, or how long he has been like this. Even if I can promote circulation, he may not recover completely. His mind could fracture. He would rather wake broken than let this bloom fester in someone else's hands." I scanned the surrounding shelves rapidly. Drelincourt's handwriting was on dozens of bottles, some recognizable and others unintelligible. Finally, I found a sealed ampule labeled Antiplus Emergo. My Latin was rusty, but the implication was obvious. "This must be it," I stated. Holmes nodded once. "Do it." I carefully drew the compound into a syringe and injected it into the vein at Drelincourt's neck. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, gradually, a tremor spread through his hand, a twitch of the fingers, a shallow gasp. His chest rose once, fell, then rose again. His eyes opened. They didn't concentrate at first. He blinked once, twice, then looked straight up. When he spoke, it was barely audible. "Not the rose, the root." Holmes leaned over him. "Mr. Drelincourt, can you hear me?" "The root," he repeated. They took the root. I showed them. The bloom, but they needed the root to bind it. I thought it was still theory until they tested it. Who? Holmes asked urgently. Who is they? But Drelincourt's eyes rolled back and he began to seize, his limbs twitching. Uncontrollably. I held him fast, trying to protect his head, but the convulsions passed almost as soon as they began. He slumped again into unconsciousness, the muscles of his face slack. He'll live, I said. But I doubt we'll get anything more from him tonight. Holmes stood very still. Then the performance continues without its author. He turned back to the shelves and began searching quickly, methodically. After a minute, he produced a long, narrow box and opened it. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a shriveled, gnarled object, half root, half tuber, roughly the length of a man's palm. It was dark as dried blood and coiled in on itself like a clenched fist. This, Holmes said, is the root he spoke of. Collins backed away instinctively. What is it? I do not know. But it is no natural specimen. It has been shaped, grafted, cultivated for purpose. There is power in this, symbolic or chemical, I cannot yet say. He closed the box and tucked it into his coat. We must get Drelincourt to a safe place, and we must prepare for what comes next. Because if they took this route, if they planned to use it, then this entire affair is about to escalate. He extinguished the lantern, leaving only the candle to cast its glow on the sleeping figure. We carried Drelincourt carefully up the stairs and into the fading night, the house behind us as silent as a crypt. Only as we reached the cab did I realize my hands were shaking. Holmes, I said quietly, what do you think they're trying? To grow? He looked at me, his eyes colder than I had seen them in weeks. A soul, he said, or something that can wear one like a mask. We returned to Baker Street well past midnight, the city cloaked in a damp stillness broken only by the occasional clatter of distant hooves or the sigh of a gas lamp guttering in its cage. Holmes had not spoken during the entire ride. His fingers tapped lightly against the velvet box in his coat pocket, and I knew that the rhythm meant his mind was balancing on the edge of several conclusions, none of which pleased him. Drelincourt lay stretched on the settee, wrapped in a blanket, his pulse steady now but shallow, his breathing barely audible. I had administered a sedative to prevent further seizures, but the damage of his long artificial slumber would not be so easily undone. He murmured from time to time, fragments of Latin, names I did not recognize, and occasionally the word mirror, always whispered with the dread of a man who feared not being watched, but being reflected. Holmes busied himself immediately upon our return, clearing the center table and arranging an array of reference materials with surgical precision. He retrieved the root from its box and placed it upon a linen cloth beneath the lamplight, then sat cross-legged before it, like a scholar before a forbidden manuscript. I kept one eye on Drelincourt and the other on Holmes, knowing better than to speak until he did. Finally, he broke the silence. Watson, in all your experience as a physician, have you ever encountered a substance capable of inducing a mental echo? I frowned. Define mental echo. A residue, he said. Not memory, but mimicry. A lingering of identity, conscious or not, that can be transferred from one body to another, not possession, but replication. No, that borders on the mystical, he nodded, unsurprised. And yet it is the implication here. Drelincourt's writing hints at a root that carries not merely pharmacological potency, but symbolic identity. A root that, when paired with the right rituals and preparations, can allow one to mirror another, to become, at least to the eye and voice and manner, indistinguishable. You think someone is impersonating him. I think someone is impersonating someone. Collins was followed by himself. Drelincourt saw the rose grow from stone. We have stumbled into a theatre of reflections, Watson, one in which the players are no longer content to wear masks. They wish to be the thing they mimic. The idea unsettled me more than I cared to admit. So, what do we do now, Holmes? Reached for his violin and began to tune it softly, the strings wailing with a tension that mirrored the heaviness of the hour. We bait the reflection. He turned to me, face calm, but voice edged with resolve. The man who left the second. Rose, the one we saw in Lambeth, was not random. He was watching Drelincourt's trail. He led us to the alley, then disappeared. which means he wants to be seen, or rather, he wants us to follow. And you intend to give him the chance? Yes, Holmes said, but on our terms. Over. The next hour, Holmes composed a note, signed with the initials PD and carefully written in the same looping hand as Drelincourt's journal. It read, "The root has flowered. Meet me where the stone last bled. Midnight. Come alone, he." Folded it, pressed a sliver of the root into the crease and sealed it with black wax. "This," he said, "we leave where he can find it." And so, just before dawn, we were once more at the edge of Greyfriars Close, the iron gate creaking as we eased it open. Holmes proceeded without hesitation to the center of the graveyard, where the rosebush remained crimson against the rock. He knelt, inserted the letter into the leaves, and withdrew. "I give it until nightfall," he replied as we returned to the street. "If we're right, he'll come, and he will appear like someone we recognize." The day passed with silent strain. Holmes scarcely moved from his seat, his eyes remote and his hands clasped beneath his chin. I transcribed my notes on Drelincourt's revival and forwarded them confidentially to a medical colleague under the guise of seeking advice on obscure toxins. Collins remained pale and silent, periodically moving to stare out the window with a mix of fear and optimism. Drelincourt thankfully slept. Night fell like a veil. Holmes dressed in dark grays and hid his face under a narrow-brimmed hat and scarf. I followed suit. We didn't bring any firearms because Holmes had told us that if he smelled a trap, he would not arrive. We must make him believe that we are unarmed and unprepared. Only then would he try the mirror. We got at Greyfriars at 10 minutes to midnight and took up position behind the decaying church wall, well out of sight of the rosebush. The mist had returned, thick and low, curling around the gravestones like smoke from a deeper fire. All was silent, save for the gentle ticking of Holmes's pocket watch. Then a form. A figure moved gently through the cemetery gate. Holmes and I are the same height, same coat, same lean profile. I only glimpsed him in silhouette, but even at a distance, my breath caught, the gait, the angle of the head. He paused to study the stones, rolling his shoulders subtly. He walked straight to the rosebush and stopped. He bent down, reached into the leaves, and took the note. I unfolded it, read. Then, without warning, he turned and gazed right at our hiding place. Holmes didn't flinch. He emerged from the shadows and stepped forwards. The figure did not run. They approached slowly, like two shadows merging in a field of stone. When they met, I stepped out of my place, my heart pounding. The stranger lifted his head. I gasped aloud. It was Holmes. Every line, every angle, every expression, even the slight furrow between his brows when he was half concentrating, half suspicious. It was more than just resemblance. It was identical. The two Holmeses stood inches apart, staring at one another in a profound silence that felt louder than speech. Then the real Holmes spoke. "You have borrowed my face," he replied coldly. "You would do better to borrow my mind." The other smiled. Holmes's smile, but slower and hungrier. "I have no need for your mind," he said, "only your name." Holmes maintained an unwavering gaze. "Why?" "To become permanent," the figure explained. "I was grown, not born. I am what the rose makes possible. I am the perfect echo." "You are a counterfeit," Holmes said. "Aren't we all?" the figure said, softly. Then, unexpectedly, he lunged. Holmes was ready. The struggle was brief and precise, like watching two dancers rehearsing the same violent choreography. But in the end, Holmes struck the impostor across the temple with a sudden upward jab of the palm. The man collapsed into the grass, unmoving. Holmes stood over him, panting once, then kneeling. "Watson, come quickly." I hurried over and knelt. As Holmes turned the man onto his side, his skin had begun to pale, to tremble, no longer in control. His eyes fluttered and unfocused. "He's unraveling," Holmes said. "The echo is breaking." Indeed, the man's features had begun to shift, not grotesquely but subtly, like wet clay losing the shape of the mold. Holmes pulled something from the man's coat, another velvet-lined case. Inside was a second root, smaller, more refined, pulsing faintly with reddish veins. "We ended here," Holmes said, snapping the box shut. "No more mirrors." and together we left the field of stone, the impostor behind us fading into mist as surely as the roses would at morning. We returned to Baker Street as the first pale signs of dawn broke through the city's smoky mist, and Holmes appeared older than he had in days. Holmes admitted to being weighted rather than exhausted. It was as if the experience at Greyfriars had introduced something into his consciousness that he couldn't simply file away, something that disrupted the boundaries he had spent a lifetime meticulously establishing. The duplicate was gone. Lestrade and his guys arrived barely minutes after we left and found no body. There are no footprints, not even the box that Holmes had confiscated, as if the earth itself had closed in on the counterfeit, drawing it back into the deep roots from which it had been coaxed. Holmes hadn't spoken since we left the cemetery. In the pleasant calm of our sitting room, he carefully withdrew the sealed case from his coat and set it on the table. Drelincourt was still sleeping, but his features were more relaxed, as if some invisible stress had been released throughout the night. Collings slumped in the corner, keeping a watchful eye on Holmes. The unfortunate man had said little since he saw the fake. I doubted he'd say anything for a while. Holmes peered at the second route silently for nearly a minute. Then, with a quiet exhale, he turned to unlock the bottom drawer of his desk. He took out a glass jar half filled with a viscous clear liquid, its label bearing only one Greek symbol, theta. He opened the root case and, using tongs, lowered the specimen into the fluid. It hissed weakly, and little bubbles rose to the surface as if the animal was dying. Destroyed, I inquired. Contained, Holmes answered. Nothing developed with such purpose should be kept exposed to light or air. The chemical in this jar prevents decay and activity. He reinstalled the lid and used wax to seal the jar. There were two, I replied gently, the original root and its polished replica. Do you think there are more? I do, he answered. How? Many, and who holds them is unknown. But I assume we were supposed to halt this one, that it was allowed to grow specifically so that we could cut it down. He turned away from the jar and stared at me with weird intensity. Watson, you asked, earlier what they were trying to grow. I no longer believe it is simply identity or mimicry. I believe they're attempting to increase permanence, a version of a guy that is not simply copied but better, free of origin, history and moral complication. And you think it began with Drelincourt? He cultivated the philosophy. Someone else weaponized it. Someone saw the rose as a tool rather than a symbol. He looked across at Drelincourt, who was sleeping, and I suspect he knows who. The ancient scholar stirred as if summoned by the words. He shifted beneath the cover, sighed softly, then opened his eyes. They were clearer now, wary, heavy with tiredness, but undeniably aware. Holmes appeared at his side in an instant. Mr. Drelincourt, he replied gently, you are safe. You are in my rooms at Baker Street. You've been sleeping for quite some time. Drelincourt blinked. How long? In 5 days. Perhaps longer if you include the preparation. The old man's fingers grasped the blanket. The root. Did it discover? A host? Holmes nodded. 2 that we know about. Someone attempted to replace me. We stopped it. Drelincourt closed his eyes. There will be others. The garden was not grown secretly. There was a circle, 5 of us in the beginning. They gradually abandoned their theories. Choose practice. I warned them. I said the rose should not be planted in the flesh. Holmes leaned in. Give me names. The old man hesitated before speaking in a scarcely discernible voice. Ferren, for sure. He was the first to try it. He vanished after claiming to discover a root of duality beneath an ossuary in Milan. Then there was Caro, who was always interested with masks and rituals. He thought memory was just a pattern to be impressed, like a seal in wax. Altham, however, is the person you should be most afraid of. Toby Altham. He had no history of his own, and hence attempted to take others. Holmes repeated the name softly. Tobias Altham. He believed the rose was a lens, Drelincourt added, and the root a reservoir. That if one could distill a man's qualities, not only his words or habits, but also the shape of his will, they could pour them into another vessel, and the new man wouldn't realize he wasn't unique. A perfect forgery, Holmes mused. No, worse, Drelincourt stated. Perfect air, an entity that considers itself real, one that could act without shame or remembrance of the theft. A man without a shadow. He began to quiver. Holmes placed a kind hand on his shoulder. "I will stop him," he said. "Tell me where he is." "I do not know." He kept moving. He had patrons, aristocracy with ancient debts. He visited no longer indexed libraries and spoke at societies whose proceedings are not published. The last I heard, he was in Norfolk, near the coastline. Something about salt preserving the seed. Holmes nodded. "That is enough." He rose and moved to the window, folding his arms and peering into the feeble morning light, as if attempting to break through the fog. "I shall go," he finally said. "Altham is no longer pleased with creating, he wants to replace, and he's had time to perfect his formula. This shows he has a plan rather than merely a route." I stepped alongside him. "I'm coming with you." He grinned, slightly. "Of course. If I had to confront myself again, I'd rather have someone who knows the original." We departed Baker Street that afternoon, under a heavy grey sky. Collins, who had seen the mirror once, continued to care for Drelincourt. Holmes sent Lestrade a cryptic message ahead of time, alerting him that he might expect odd developments. As we boarded the train to Norfolk, I cast another peek at Holmes. His gaze was far away, focused not on the passing fields but on something internal, a war brewing not only with an adversary in the world, but also with the implications of what that enemy signified. "You believe Altham means to replace someone of importance," I corrected him. "I do," he responded, "and I believe the first experiment was meant to prove that it could be done, even to a man like me." I hesitated before asking, "And if it had succeeded?" He stared at me, actually looked, and his words was as quiet as the train's gentle pace on the tracks. "Then I would be the one sitting next to you now, and neither of us would know." The train continued eastward toward the sea, and an unseen garden where something other than human was already blooming. The train rocked gently as it wound through the wide stretches of moor and marshland, the scenery beyond our window gradually flattening into the harsh, wind-bitten emptiness that defined the Norfolk coast. Holmes remained immobile next me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze unfocused, never asleep, but turned inward, as if his thoughts were arranging themselves into a design only he could see. I did not interrupt. I had long since realized that his silences were not pauses in thought, but the process of thinking itself, as necessary to him as breathing. We arrived shortly after dusk at a station that barely justified its name, a solitary platform, a shuttered ticket booth and a path leading through a scant pine forest toward the settlement of Halversham. It was not marked on most maps. The air here had a raw salt edge that was as sharp as a blade, and the gulls overhead screamed out warnings rather than delight. Holmes sniffed once and said just, "We're close." We discovered a couple of rooms at the village's only inn, a grey-bricked house slouched on the edge of a collapsing bluff, its shutters shivering weakly from the wind even when closed. The proprietor, a bent woman with driftwood hands, looked at Holmes with a mix of distrust and devotion, as if she recognized him, by archetype more than name. When he asked about Tobias Altham, she shook her head slowly but did not appear surprised. "There's no one here by that name," she said, "but the old estate just east of here, Greywit Hall, has received a visitor, man alone. I've been there. 3 weeks now. Keeps to himself. Does he take deliveries? Twice per week. Boxes, sealed tightly. There's also a gardener. Young boy. Doesn't say much." Holmes nodded graciously. "Thank you." As we climbed the tiny stairway to our rooms, I leaned in. "Greywit," Holmes nodded. "It was originally owned by the Ferncombe family, now extinct. The property has been passed down through eccentric heirs and pseudonymous trusts. Drelincourt's mention of patrons is now more understandable. A house that disappears into private hands every 2 years is ideal for a secret garden." We ate little that evening. Holmes drank only a cup of broth and a piece of bread, declining brandy with a shake of his head. We headed off on foot at midnight, when the moon rose in a bone-white arc over the moors. The path to Greywit Hall meandered along the edge of a marsh, and each step on the narrow trail caused a delicate shiver in the reeds. Holmes moved quickly, his cloak tight around him, his eyes searching ahead with such intensity that I felt as if we were already in someone else's dream. Whodunit presented itself not in silhouette but rather in quiet. It didn't loom, it waited. The home stood behind a low stone wall, its windows dark and the facade mottled with age and spreading moss. But it was the garden that drew the breath. Behind the mansion spread rows and rows of perfectly maintained hedges curving in labyrinthine spirals, and between them, impossible to see by moonlight, blossomed a lattice of roses so dark in color that they resembled black. They didn't wobble with the breeze. They pulsed, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. Alive in a way that made your skin ache. Holmes crouched just beyond the gate, studying the house and garden through a small brass field glass. "There," he muttered. "Greenhouse, rear of the estate. Do you see the vents along the roofline?" I nodded. "That is where it has been prepared. The mimicking does not start in the intellect, Watson. It begins with the breath, which is inhaled, absorbed, and distilled into blood." "The scent is the primer. And the root?" I asked. Holmes's gaze narrowed. "The root is the key. The smell opens the door. The root goes through it." We waited another hour, observing, when a man appeared from behind the house. He approached the greenhouse with a lantern shielded from the wind. He proceeded with the accuracy of someone who had walked this way many times before, not hurried or slow, but deliberate. When he turned to unlock the glass door, the light caught his profile. My breath caught it was Holmes. There is no variant, no flaws. Even the curl on the collar was identical. Holmes remained motionless beside me. "We move now," he said. We crossed the field in silence, dropping low beneath the hedge line and approaching the greenhouse from the far side. The structure was large, nearly 30 feet long, with antique iron frames and panes of glass that had been cleaned with painstaking care. Rows of tables were set up inside, illuminated by alchemical lamps. Each had a glass cylinder similar to a coffin, and bodies were suspended in fluid or stretched out on silk within. Some are incomplete, some are plainly deceased, but one, near the center, sat erect, breathing. Holmes slipped via the side entrance as a duplicate. Holmes continued to work at a bench with his back turned. The genuine Holmes motioned for me to wait near the door. He stepped into the light. The replica turned at once. No surprises were registered. He simply observed. "So," replied the copy, "the original returns." Holmes inclined his head. "Tell me, are you aware of who you are? Or are you just echoing me?" He smiled. "You always were insufferably curious." Holmes didn't blink. "Then you are Altham?" "Not quite." The figure approached him with cautious steps. "Altham has transcended names. I am a bloom from his design. You see, detective, you're admired, even by those who want to replace you. However, adoration is not worship. It's jealousy in a nicer garment." Holmes looked at the erect figure in the tank. "Who is that?" my heir remarked the double. "He will replace the man who replaces you." Holmes moved quickly. With one step, he swept the nearby lantern off the bench, shattering it across the floor. Fire burst into life in an instant, engulfing the scattered ingredients. The duplicate reeled. Back, his face lighted with unexpected fear, an expression Holmes did not share. I rushed forward to join the fray. Holmes struck first, knocking the man into the glass of a culture tank. A bloom of red, not rose but blood, spread across the panel. The body slumped. Holmes was already hauling the upright figure out of the cylinder, gasping and confused, but still alive. "We go," he said. "Now." We fled into the darkness as flames devoured the greenhouse, its flowers shriveling in strange screams of fragrance and smoke. When we arrived at the gate, the house beyond it was already on fire, and Whodunit Hall had turned to ash by the time the sun had risen over the sea. Back in London, the man we had rescued remained unidentified, his face familiar but blank. Drelincourt examined him for days, but discovered no memory or identity, only reflexes and tone. The shell designed to house someone else's future. Holmes sat at the window for a long time that week, his violin unplayed and his pipe forgotten. "What disturbs me, Watson," he said finally, "is not that they attempted to replicate me. They succeeded, until I asked who he was. He had no response. And yet—" He smiled. I said nothing, because I too had seen that smile. And part of me feared we hadn't burned down the garden completely, only pruned it. In the days that followed our return to London, there was an odd silence on Baker Street. Not a peaceful silence, but a strained stillness, as if a room was holding its breath after something sacred had been disturbed. Holmes paced sparingly. His violin sat untouched in its case. He sat for hours in the deep armchair facing the fire, not reading or writing, but staring into the flames with the somber contemplation of a man who has seen the shape of something he cannot yet identify. The weird creature we had rescued, the heir, as the duplicate Holmes had referred to him, was still under the watchful eye of Drelincourt and Collins, both of whom had temporarily moved into the building's back rooms at Holmes's request. The man, or creation, or echo, was calm, quiet, and unnervingly attentive. He didn't say anything, but he listened so intently that his silence felt like a question waiting to be answered. He reproduced moves with remarkable accuracy. Collins coughed, and the man coughed faintly a half-minute later. When Drelincourt spilled a teacup by accident, the man blinked and his fingers twitched. The likeness to a kid learning the mechanics of personhood was difficult to overlook, but Holmes had prohibited any direct tests. "He is not a specimen," he explained. "He's evidence, and perhaps a warning." On the third morning, a letter was hand-delivered with no return address. The envelope was stamped with an unusual seal, an ancient pattern of a rose coiled around a flame. Holmes flipped it over twice before opening it with his pocket-knife. I observed his expression carefully as he read. He furrowed his brow once, then again, but he made no noise. When he handed me the note, his voice was quiet. We were not the only audience. The paper included a single paragraph written in calligraphic hand. "Mr. Holmes, you've demonstrated your creativity and maintained your primacy, for the time being. But each system rejects its shadow only once. The following will not be a mirror. The following will be a mask. Masks, as you know, are meant to be worn. No signature. There is no sign of ink composition or watermark." Holmes's fingers trembled faintly as he turned it back and forth under the gas lamp. Then he exhaled. "It's begun again." I attempted to keep the discomfort out of my voice. "This wasn't Altham?" "No. This is a whole different pen." The syntax lacks Altham's self-importance. It's cooler, structured, which shows this new writer is not an ideologue. He or she is a planner. "Then the network's larger than we knew." "Not larger," Holmes replied. "Deeper. The root has branches, Watson. We torched a flower, but the hand that cultivated it is unseen." He moved to the shelf and took the sealed jar containing the second root, the one stolen from the impostor, in Greyfriars Close. It had darkened in the solution, and the faint vein-like structures inside had vanished. But it hadn't decayed. Holmes held it at eye level. This, whatever it is, was not intended to perish. It was intended to wait. We don't know how many more are stored, hidden, buried, or worse, already planted. His eyes narrowed. "We need to trace the pattern, Watson. Not the individuals who wear the masks, but the people who distribute them. Those who design the garden." He took Drelincourt's notebook from the desk and opened it over several pages. Symbols, names, sketches, many of them I'd seen previously. But one, repeated in the margins and barely discernible, had gone unmentioned until today. "Do you recognize this?" Holmes inquired, touching the symbol for a closed eye ringed by thorns. I shake my head. Nor did I until last night. It appears in a number of suppressed monographs on ritualistic mimesis, the cult of the Parhelion, and the obscured self movement. Groups focused with erasing their origins rather than with imitation. The act of becoming through replacement. Cult? Not in the usual sense. No robes, no chanting, no temples. They are intellectuals, aristocrats, chemists, and playwrights. Scattered. However, they are all guided by the same principle. Identity is obsolete. That permanency can be engineered. And history changed through the act of replication. He closed the journal. And the closed eye? I asked. It represents the original's consent, the moment the true self stops observing. It is not the death of the body that enables replacement, but the loss of recognition. I felt a shiver down my spine. And you think, they've already succeeded? Holmes didn't respond. He reached for a folder that he had kept sealed since our return from Norfolk. Inside were a slew of notes, newspaper clippings, and telegrams, all handwritten in Holmes's precise script. Observe, he stated, setting them out. A clerk in Whitehall who went missing for 2 weeks and returned with no memory of his absence, but fluent in Latin with a different gait. Bath's bishop no longer acknowledges his own sermons. A pianist in Brighton who only performs with her left hand, despite all previous records indicating she was right-handed. Small things. But together, they echo, I mumbled. Holmes nodded. Small flaws in the replication. They may not even realize they have been affected, but the trace stays. So we catalogue the fractures. He tapped his pen on the rose seal letter. Whoever wrote this knows we've begun to see the cracks, and they are urging us not to look any deeper. Then we look further, I explained. Holmes turned to face me with a look of concern rather than determination. Watson, he replied, there may come a time when you must choose between the Holmes you know and the one with my face. And if that time comes, do not hesitate. I said nothing for a long time. Then slowly, I opened the side table drawer, retrieved the handgun I had stored there, and placed it between us on the table. I followed you through fog, fire, and madness, I told you. If one of you lifts your hand against the other, I'll know the difference. Even if you don't. Holmes gave a slight smile. That is precisely why I trust you. We sat there, the two. Of us in the deepening darkness, surrounded by the crackling of the fire and the faint sound of breathing from the next room, the respiration of a man molded rather than born. A man who may one day feel he is someone else entirely. Outside, beyond Baker Street, London slept restlessly, unknowing that its mirrors were no longer for reflection. Some were now doors, others sustained wounds. The next morning dawned colourless and apprehensive, with the sky over London pressed low and drab, as if hesitant to reveal what had changed in the city beneath. Holmes was awake before me. I found him staring at the mirror over the fireplace, gazing at himself as if it were a stranger he was attempting to identify. He did not acknowledge me at first. Only after a whole minute did he turn, slowly, with an odd expression, less troubled than suspended, as if he were waiting for something within himself to say before he could. I've begun to question whether recognition is a stable phenomenon, he told me. Not of others, but of the self. I reached for the kettle, hoping that a cup of tea would restore some normalcy. That's a dangerous line of thinking for a man whose profession depends on certainty. Holmes did not smile. Certainty is an illusion that separates reason from crazy. However, when the illusion begins to unravel, reason is no more a secure harbor. I poured him a cup without asking and presented it to him. He took it absently, sat down, and opened the folded newspaper on the table, but not to read the news. He went immediately to the obituary section. There, he replied, tapping the page. I leaned in. A brief notice. Sir Lionel Marsh, retired ambassador, died quietly at his London residence. He was well known for his contributions to East African trade relations and as a benefactor of botanical groups. I raised an eyebrow. He was one of Drelincourt's backers. Holmes nodded. Mentioned in a letter long ago. Drelincourt expressed admiration for symbolic vegetation. A sponsor of minor cultic symposiums. His death is not inherently suspicious, but the timing is. The obituary only says he died peacefully. Yes, Holmes said, and yet I saw him yesterday morning at the Royal Society's reading room. Or someone who wore his face. My breath hitched slightly. Are you sure? I'm certain about the gait, the left limp, the way he stroked his chin while thinking. The face was blurred by the wide-brimmed hat, but it was him, or an echo. I sat slowly. Then we're too late, Holmes's eyes gleamed. Or just on time. If the garden of reflections is blooming again, its gardeners must move with haste. The more successful they are, the more reckless they become. He reached across the table and pulled out a thin stack of telegrams from beneath the paper. I had queries from around the continent. Discreet channels. Every known associate of Altham or Drelincourt. The majority are scattered, but one name appeared in murmurs. A man known simply as Virex, a pseudonym, of course. I'd never heard the name before. What's he done? Nothing, publicly. But he appears on the outskirts of every known rupture. A talk in Dresden resulted in a scholar losing his memory. A gallery in Prague whose owner can no longer recognize her own art. A private dinner in Paris ended with 3 guests claiming to be the same person. He never speaks, never sign. But the sign, a closed eye ringed by thorns, appears on his calling card. Story, do we know where he is now? Holmes picked one card from the telegram bundle and laid it flat. A London address. Fitzrovia, a private club, unmarked, the kind of establishment that has no hours or windows. I believe, Holmes replied softly, that the garden has discovered fruitful ground here in the city, and that Virex is nurturing it right under our feet. I stood. When do we go? Holmes stood as well, but his hand gripped my wrist with surprising vigor. Watson, if what awaits us has progressed beyond mimicry, if it has acquired adaptation, we may be entering a chamber that knows us better than we know ourselves. Then we confront it before it grows bolder, I said. Or deeper. We went just before noon, dressed plainly and unarmed save for the handgun in my pocket, and Holmes's concealed blade tucked beneath the cuff of his left wrist. Fitzrovia was peaceful that day, shrouded in an afternoon fog that softened the outlines, of buildings and people alike. The location directed us to a curved iron gate on a side street, no bigger than an alley. A knocker shaped like a rose stem coiled into a fist protruded from the center of the black door. Holmes touched it, paused and knocked once. No sound from within. The door slowly creaked open. The interior was dimly illuminated, with soft gas sconces down a velvet-lined corridor. We stepped inside, and the door silently closed behind us. It all was silent. Not the silence of emptiness, but of attention. We moved onward. The corridor branched left, then right, and finally sank in a spiral that seemed deeper than it was. Finally, it expanded into a large room, octagonal. Each wall was covered in tall mirrors. A single chair stood in the center, facing the farthest wall. A man sat in a chair, tall, composed, returned to us. Holmes stepped forward. Virex, he answered. The man did not turn. You've mimicked the structure of performance, Holmes added. But not the soul. A trick isn't a transformation. What are you? The man stood. When he turned, my breath caught. It was Holmes, not a duplicate. This is not a counterfeit. However, Holmes was an idealized character, sharper, smoother. The cheekbones are slightly more refined. The eyes are more vibrant. He wore Holmes' face in the same way that an artist would produce a portrait, fixing nature's asymmetry into something too flawless. The thing smiled. I am what you leave behind when you forget yourself. Holmes did not move. I'm the Holmes who acts without hesitation, the Holmes who sees through all veils without mercy, who knows the outcome and decides it before the game starts. You are. Hollow, Holmes replied. No, the monster answered. I am distilled. It made a step ahead. I raised my revolver. Holmes raised his hand, not to me, but to the mirrors. Then show your reflection. And the mirrors were illuminated. However, none displayed the idealized figure. They showed us, Holmes and me, but in distinct poses. Minor changes. 1,000 decisions remain unmade. 1,000 selves. The room was a showcase for our own divergence, and the thing watched everything. You see, it asked, the self isn't fixed. It is a garden of shadows. I merely choose one to become real. Holmes glanced at it before taking a step forward. And that is why you fail. He reached into his coat and pulled out the sealed container. The root, he threw it to the floor. It shattered. The fragrance hit you right away, clove, vinegar, blood. The mirrors broke. The figure recoiled, flickering and trembling, not in agony but indecisive, as if reality had lost confidence in itself. You grew through imitation, Holmes continued, his voice rising, But truth isn't symmetry. It is fractured. I fired once. The bullet went through the item, but it did not fall. It dissolved, layer after layer, like ash collapsing into mist. The mirrors cracked again, this time folding inward, and their reflections merging into blackness. We stood alone in a room without any walls. Only one chair is currently empty. Holmes turned to me. It was never a person, he claimed. It was a decision made real, but it has not been made. I nodded but did not lower the rifle, because in that silence something else persisted. Not a presence, a possibility, a deeper root. We walked from the club into the late afternoon light, eyes blinking against the pale glare, as if we had stepped out of something far older and worse. For a few while Holmes stood motionless on the curb. His coat was torn at the sleeve, and a little smear of the root's scent, clove and something metallic, remained faintly on his cuffs. I said nothing. Language appeared to be the last thing that should spoil the moment. He turned slowly to me, and for the first time in days, his countenance conveyed not dread nor calculation, but a kind of peace. Fatigued, definitely, but clear. He took a big inhale as if regaining full use of his own skin. "It's done," I said finally. Holmes offered a slight nod. "As far as this layer reaches. And the others? They'll recoil. For a time. Whatever structure existed beneath the mirror has been smashed, but nature despises a vacuum, and so do those who try to fill it." We walked silently till we reached Baker Street. The environment seemed strangely normal. Omnibuses passed, dogs barked, and a paperboy yelled the news about a shipping delay in the channel. The gaslight flickered in the front window, and Mrs. Hudson greeted us at the door with the same anxious expression she always gave when Holmes returned from something horrible. This was happening quite frequently by now. Inside, the man from Greywit, the so-called heir, was gone. Collins claimed he vanished overnight, leaving no trace. Drelincourt had returned to his cottage outside Oxford, taking with him the remnants of the research, the sealed diaries, and the advice Holmes had given him. Bury your work where even your mind cannot find it. I don't believe he was the last of them, I replied that evening, as Holmes sat smoking by the fire and stared at the flames once more. No, Holmes responded. However, he was the first to go willingly. That implies something. What? Whatever was sewed into him didn't hold. Something within him refused to accept permanence. Perhaps something human. Holmes grinned slightly. Perhaps. He tapped his pipe against the grate, then turned to me. "Do you know what the greatest danger in the garden was, Watson? They weren't able to replicate, alternatively they could substitute. It was when they began to feel what they had created was superior." I nodded. "The ideal is always dangerous when confused for the real." Holmes stood, stretched, and crossed to the shelf where his notebooks lived. He pulled a blank one down, turned to the first page and scrawled something I couldn't see. When he finished, he labeled the spine with his immaculate script. "The Garden Hypothesis, contained for now." I looked at him for a long time, then quietly asked, "How do I know it's you?" He did not flinch, did not smile. He merely gazed at me with the weight of remembrance and exhaustion in his eyes. "Because, Watson," replied the detective, "only the real Holmes would admit he nearly lost the thread." I believed him. Later that night, as London exhaled into fog again and sleep crept toward the city's outskirts, I passed the study and spotted Holmes at the mirror, standing as he had that morning, gazing through his reflection rather than into it. I did not disturb him, because some mirrors no longer contain glass, some represent thresholds, others issue warnings. In the case of Sherlock Holmes and the rose that sprouted from stone, the garden was not completely devastated. It had merely retreated, waiting for recognition before falling asleep again.